For 13 days in October of 1962, the world as we know it almost ended. For nearly 2 weeks, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the precipice of a full-scale nuclear war. Humanity had created the power to cause its own extinction, and two men, separated by thousands of miles in a chasm of ideology, held the triggers. Every decision brought the hands of the doomsday clock closer to midnight. This is the story of those 13 days, a day-by-day account of how the Cuban Missile Crisis pushed the world to the brink of annihilation, and how, through a combination of brinksmanship, secret diplomacy, and sheer luck, we managed to pull back. To understand how the world found itself in such a perilous position, we have to go back to the years following the end of the Second World War. The defeat of Nazi Germany had left two superpowers standing, the United States and the Soviet Union. They were former allies who now viewed each other with deep suspicion and hostility. A new kind of conflict began, a Cold War that was fought in the shadows through proxy wars, espionage, and a technological arms race. The world was split in two. On one side stood the United States and its Western allies, champions of capitalism and democracy. On the other, the Soviet Union and its communist bloc, driven by a global revolutionary ideology. An Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill famously called it, had descended across Europe, dividing the continent. The defining feature of this new war was a terrifying new weapon, the atomic bomb. First, the United States, and then, in 1949, the Soviet Union, possessed the power to destroy entire cities in a single, blinding flash. Throughout the 1950s, this technology grew exponentially more powerful with the development of the hydrogen bomb. Both nations built vast arsenals of nuclear weapons, enough to destroy the world many times over. They built bombers capable of flying across continents and developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, that could deliver a nuclear warhead to a target halfway around the world in under 30 minutes. This led to a strategic doctrine with a fittingly grim acronym, MAD, for Mutually Assured Destruction. The logic was simple. If either superpower launched a nuclear attack, the other would detect it and launch a devastating retaliatory strike before the first missiles even landed. The result would be the complete and utter destruction of both nations and likely much of the rest of the world. There could be no winner in a nuclear war. This balance of terror, in a strange way, kept the peace, but it was a peace balanced on a knife's edge. A single miscalculation, a technical glitch, or a rash decision by a leader under pressure could trigger an unstoppable chain of events leading to global catastrophe. This was the world of 1962. A world living under the constant low-level hum of existential dread. Schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under their desks in a futile exercise against a nuclear blast. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. The threat felt frighteningly real and ever-present. At the center of this global drama were three vastly different leaders. In Washington, there was the young, charismatic 45-year-old president, John F. Kennedy. He had come into office projecting an image of vigor and confidence, but he was still relatively untested on the world stage, and he was haunted by a major foreign policy failure. Just a year earlier, in 1961, a CIA-backed invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs had ended in humiliating disaster. The operation, which Kennedy had inherited from the previous administration and approved, made him look weak and indecisive to his enemies. Kennedy knew that his adversary in Moscow was testing him, and he was determined not to be seen as folding under pressure again. That adversary was the 68-year-old Soviet Premier, Nikita Khrushchev. A complex, emotional, and often volatile man, Khrushchev was a true believer in communism, but also a pragmatist who understood the horrors of war. He was a gambler who had risen through the brutal politics of the Stalinist era. He saw an opportunity in Cuba. Placing nuclear missiles just 90 miles from the coast of Florida was an audacious move. It would dramatically alter the strategic balance of power, counteracting the American missiles already stationed in Turkey, right on the Soviet Union's border. It would also be the ultimate guarantee that the United States would never again try to invade Cuba and topple his new communist ally. And finally, in Havana, there was that ally, Fidel Castro. The 36-year-old revolutionary leader had overthrown a corrupt United States-backed dictator just 3 years earlier. He was fiercely nationalistic and deeply committed to his revolution. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro was convinced that another, larger American attack was inevitable. For him, the presence of Soviet missiles was not an act of aggression, but a defensive shield. It was the only way to ensure the survival of his nation and his revolution against its superpower neighbor. The interests and anxieties of these three men were about to converge on the small Caribbean island, creating the most dangerous standoff in human history. In this episode, we will take you inside the storm. Thanks to a secret recording system that President Kennedy had installed in the White House, large portions of the high-stakes debates that took place are now declassified. Using these recordings, along with recently opened Soviet archives and the personal memoirs of key players like the president's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, we can reconstruct this crisis day by day. We will trace the path from the initial shocking discovery by a U-2 spy plane through the tense implementation of a naval quarantine, the fiery confrontations of the United Nations, the secret back-channel negotiations, and the terrifying moments on a day that would become known as Black Saturday, when a single misstep could have plunged the world into nuclear war. Part 1. The Secret Unveiled. The morning of Tuesday, October 16, 1962, began like any other for President John F. Kennedy. He was in his residence at the White House, reading the morning papers. But at 8:45 a.m., his national security advisor, George Bundy, was shown in with a grave expression. He was carrying a file of photographs, and he told the president that there was a situation developing that he needed to see immediately. Spreading the images out, Bundy revealed what a high-altitude U-2 surveillance plane had captured 2 days earlier, flying 6 miles above the western end of Cuba. The black and white photos were grainy, but to the trained eye of a photo analyst, their meaning was unmistakable. They showed clear evidence of construction sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles. They showed missile transporter erectors, fuel tank trailers, and launch pads being hastily assembled in the Cuban jungle. These were not defensive weapons. The medium-range SS-4 missiles had a reach of over 1,000 miles. From Cuba, they could strike Washington, D.C., Dallas, or Cape Canaveral. The intermediate-range SS-5 missiles, once operational, could travel over 2,000 miles, putting nearly the entire continental United States within their range, with the exception of the Pacific Northwest. For the first time, the Soviet Union would have the ability to launch a devastating nuclear strike against America with only a few minutes of warning. The strategic balance of the Cold War, the terrifying equilibrium of mutually assured destruction, was about to be shattered. The Kennedy administration had repeatedly and publicly warned the Soviets against placing offensive weapons in Cuba. Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko had personally assured the president just weeks earlier that only defensive weaponry was being supplied to Castro. They had been lied to. The threat was no longer theoretical and thousands of miles away. It was now sitting just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Kennedy knew immediately that this secret could not be kept for long. The missile sites would soon be operational, and eventually they would be discovered by the public. He had to act. But how? He instructed Bundy to convene a meeting of his most trusted senior advisors at 11:45 that morning. He insisted on absolute secrecy. If the Soviets knew that he knew, it could force their hand. If the American public found out before he had a plan, it could cause mass panic and political chaos. The 13 men who gathered in the cabinet room that day would become known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. This group included the President and Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, the President's brother and most trusted confidant, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor. For the next 12 days, this group would meet in secret, debating, arguing, and searching for a way out of an impossible situation. Thanks to President Kennedy's secret taping system, we have a remarkable record of their conversations. The tapes reveal men grappling with unimaginable pressure, fully aware that the fate of the world rested on their judgment. From the very first meeting, the advisors were split into two camps, which would later be defined as the Hawks and the Doves. The Hawks, led by the military leadership, saw the missiles as an intolerable act of military aggression that demanded a swift and overwhelming response. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Taylor, argued for an immediate airstrike. He was soon joined by the formidable and notoriously blunt Air Force Chief of Staff, General Curtis LeMay. LeMay had commanded the devastating firebombing raids on Japan during World War II and had built the Strategic Air Command into a global nuclear force. He had little patience for diplomacy. In a later meeting with the president, LeMay would argue that a military attack was the only option, dismissing the risks of a Soviet response. He told Kennedy that the Soviets would do nothing. He called the naval blockade weak and compared it to appeasement. For LeMay and the other chiefs, the presence of the missiles was an act of war, and failing to respond with force would be seen by Khrushchev as a sign of profound American weakness. The initial plan for the airstrike was sobering. It would involve hundreds of bombing sorties, not just against the missile sites, but against Soviet-manned anti-aircraft batteries and Cuban airfields as well. The military planners could not, however, guarantee that they would destroy 100% of the missiles. If even one missile survived and was launched, it could incinerate an American city, killing millions. Furthermore, an attack would inevitably kill the Soviet military personnel who were building and guarding the sites. This would be a direct act of war against the Soviet Union, and it was almost certain that Khrushchev would be forced to retaliate. The president pressed his generals on this point. What would the Soviets do in response? The military's best guess was that they would likely strike back in another part of the world where they held a tactical advantage. Most likely, the isolated and vulnerable city of West Berlin. Such a move could easily escalate into a full-scale war in Europe. The path of the Hawks led directly to a high-stakes, violent confrontation. On the other side were the Dubs, who urged caution and a less direct approach. This group included Secretary of Defense McNamara. Though he was a numbers-driven analyst, McNamara was deeply troubled by the unknown variables of a military strike. He began to argue that a surgical airstrike was a fantasy. It would be a massive, bloody attack that would force a Soviet reprisal. He, along with others like the President's special counsel Ted Sorensen and Attorney General Robert Kennedy, began to champion an alternative, a naval blockade. The idea was to surround Cuba with American warships and stop any more Soviet ships from delivering military equipment. It was a firm and visible response, but it was not a direct attack. It put the next move on Khrushchev. It was a way to challenge the Soviets without firing the first shot. To avoid the legal implications of an official blockade, which is an act of war, the term quarantine was chosen. It sounded less aggressive, more defensive, and even medical, as if they were isolating an infection. But it was still a powerful and risky move. It was a direct confrontation between the US Navy and Soviet shipping on the high seas. What would happen if a Soviet captain refused to stop? Would the US Navy be forced to fire on a Soviet vessel, sinking it and potentially starting a war? No one knew. For President Kennedy, the dilemma was immense. The Bay of Pigs fiasco a year earlier had left him wary of the CIA and the military's confident predictions. He knew that the so-called experts could be disastrously wrong. He felt the weight of the Hawks' argument. He could not appear weak. The 1962 midterm elections were just weeks away, and if he was seen as backing down, the political consequences would be severe. More importantly, he believed that if Khrushchev got away with this unchallenged, it would embolden the Soviets to push further in other volatile parts of the world, like Berlin. Yet, he was also acutely aware of what nuclear war meant. He had once asked a Pentagon official what the estimated casualties would be in a nuclear exchange, and was told the number could be 70 million Americans. The thought horrified him. Throughout the first few days of the crisis, from Wednesday, October 17th to Thursday the 18th, the secret debates continued inside the cabinet room. To maintain an illusion of normalcy, President Kennedy continued with his public schedule. He met with the Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko, on the 18th. Gromyko, who almost certainly did not know about the missile deployment, looked the president in the eye and repeated the lie that all Soviet aid to Cuba was purely defensive. Kennedy did not tip his hand. He listened calmly, knowing that the photos in his desk proved Gromyko was either lying or ignorant. After the meeting, Kennedy left for a series of scheduled campaign stops in the Midwest. The public saw a president focused on domestic politics, completely unaware of the frantic, secret deliberations happening back in Washington. By Friday, October 19th, the tide within XCOM was beginning to turn. The group was now leaning away from the immediate airstrike. The moral dimension of a surprise attack weighed heavily on several members, particularly Robert Kennedy. He passed a note to his brother during one meeting, reminding him of how the United States had condemned Japan for its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. He worried that a similar unannounced attack on Cuba would tarnish America's image in the eyes of the world for generations. Furthermore, the practical problems with the airstrike were becoming more apparent. The Air Force couldn't guarantee success, the risk of Soviet casualties was too high, and the potential for a disastrous escalation was incalculable. The quarantine plan, while still dangerous, offered more control. It was a graduated response. It gave Khrushchev time to think, to consider his options, and to communicate. It was a test of will. By Saturday, October 20th, after returning to Washington under the public guise of having a cold, President Kennedy made his decision. He convened ExComm and announced his choice. There would be no immediate airstrike. The first step would be the quarantine. But this was only the first step. The military was ordered to prepare for a full-scale invasion of Cuba should the quarantine fail. Now, the challenge was to present this decision to the world. A speech was drafted. Plans were made to brief former presidents and congressional leaders. Diplomatic cables were prepared to inform America's allies. The public, who for 5 days had gone about their lives in blissful ignorance, was about to be told that their world was on the brink of nuclear war. The secret was about to be unveiled. Part 2. The World on Notice. By Monday, October 22nd, the secret deliberations of ExComm were over. A decision had been made. Now, the president had to inform the world. The day was meticulously planned. In the morning, Secretary of State Dean Rusk held a tense meeting with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, handing him an advance copy of the president's speech just 1 hour before it was to be delivered. Dobrynin read the text, his face turning pale. He denied the existence of the missiles and left immediately to communicate with Moscow. All across Washington, American officials were briefing Allied ambassadors. The message was clear. This was a grave crisis, and the United States was asking for its allies' support. At the same time, the United States military was moving to a heightened state of readiness. Forces around the globe were placed on DEFCON 3, an increased alert level just below preparations for war. As evening approached, the sense of dread across the country was palpable. Television networks had been announcing all day that the president would be making an address of the utmost national importance. At 7 p.m. Eastern Time, President John F. Kennedy sat at his desk in the Oval Office and spoke to the American people and to the world. He began calmly, but his words carried an unprecedented gravity. He laid out the facts, explaining that his administration had unmistakable evidence of the construction of offensive missile sites on the island of Cuba. He described the range of these missiles and the direct threat they posed to cities across the Americas. This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base, he said, by the presence of these large, long-range and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction, constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas. Then he announced his response. He detailed a 7-step plan. The first, and most critical, was the immediate implementation of a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba. He was careful with his language. A quarantine, not a blockade. But the meaning was the same. A line was being drawn around the island. He made it clear that any ship from any nation carrying offensive weapons would be turned back. Then came the starkest warning of all, aimed directly at the Kremlin. President Kennedy declared that it would be the policy of the United States to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. This was the doctrine of mutually assured destruction made terrifyingly personal. A single launch from Cuba would trigger a global nuclear war. The world now knew the stakes. The speech sent a shockwave across the globe. In the United States, people reacted with a mixture of fear and determination. There were runs on grocery stores as families stocked up on canned goods and bottled water. Church services were filled with people praying for peace. The illusion of safety provided by 2 vast oceans had been shattered. The enemy was no longer a distant threat, but one poised just 90 miles from American shores. Immediately following the president's address, the U.S. military machine escalated its alert status. For the first and only confirmed time in its history, the Strategic Air Command, America's nuclear bomber force, was moved to DEFCON 2. This was the highest level of alert short of actual war. 60 B-52 bombers, each armed with multiple hydrogen bombs, were sent into the air on continuous patrol routes near the Soviet Union. 1/8 of the entire bomber force was airborne at all times, ready to proceed to their targets on a moment's notice. The nation's arsenal of 105 intercontinental ballistic missiles was brought to full readiness. In Florida, a massive military force was assembled, preparing for a possible land invasion of Cuba. The world was now on a full war footing. The quarantine line was drawn 500 miles out from the coast of Cuba. More than 180 U.S. warships, including aircraft carriers and destroyers, moved into position to enforce it. The line was a challenge, a dare, thrown down in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The question on everyone's mind inside the White House was, what would Khrushchev do? Would he challenge the quarantine? On Wednesday, October 24th, they got their first indication. U.S. intelligence reported that more than 24 Soviet ships were steaming towards the quarantine line. Several of them were known to be carrying military cargo. Among them were 2 freighters, the Gagarin and the Kormeles, and they were approaching the line at speed. They were accompanied by a Soviet submarine. This was the first major test. If the Soviet captains were under orders to ignore the quarantine, the U.S. Navy would have to respond. The protocol was to signal the ship to stop. If it refused, a warning shot of a star shell would be fired. If it still refused, a shot would be fired into the ship's rudder to disable it. But in the tense atmosphere, anything could go wrong. A stray shot, a nervous commander, a misunderstanding could lead to a firefight that could not be contained. Inside the XCOM meeting room, the tension was unbearable. They watched the plot maps, tracking the progress of the Soviet ships as they drew closer and closer to the American destroyers. Secretary of Defense McNamara was acutely aware of the danger. He worried that a local naval commander might take matters into his own hands. He got on the phone directly with the Chief of Naval Operations to ensure that the Navy's actions were being tightly controlled from Washington. President Kennedy was reportedly grim, telling his brother that it felt like the politicians and the military men are stumbling towards a nuclear war. Then, as the Soviet ships neared the line, something happened. Intelligence reports began coming in that the first ships had stopped dead in the water. Then reports came that others were beginning to alter their course, turning away from Cuba. It was a moment of profound, if temporary, relief. Sitting in the State Department, Dean Rusk looked over at George Bundy and uttered one of the most famous lines of the crisis. "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." Khrushchev had made a decision. He was not willing to start a world war over a naval confrontation in the Atlantic. He had chosen to respect the quarantine line, at least for now. While this was a major victory and a vital de-escalation, the fundamental problem remained. The ships at sea may have been stopped, but the missiles were already in Cuba. And construction on the launch sites was continuing at a frantic pace. The quarantine had bought time, but it had not solved the crisis. The focus now shifted to another arena, the court of world opinion. On Thursday, October 25th, the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session. The American ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson, was tasked with presenting the American case. Stevenson had been one of the earliest and most vocal doves within XCOM, initially advocating for a purely diplomatic solution. Some, like General LeMay, had even viewed him as an appeaser. But now, in the public forum of the UN, Stevenson became the prosecutor. He delivered a powerful, methodical presentation outlining the Soviet deception and the threat posed by the missiles. He was followed by the Soviet ambassador Valerian Zorin. Zorin responded with bluster and denial, accusing the United States of piratical acts and hysterical warmongering. He flatly denied the existence of any Soviet offensive missiles in Cuba, dismissing the American claims as lies. This set the stage for one of the most dramatic confrontations in the history of the United Nations. Adlai Stevenson asked for the floor again. He looked directly at his Soviet counterpart. "All right, sir," he said. "Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation. Yes or no?" Zorin was visibly flustered. He replied evasively, saying, "I am not in an American courtroom, sir," and refused to answer the question. Stevenson pressed his advantage. "You are in the courtroom of world opinion right now," he declared, "and you can answer yes or no." Zorin still refused. Then Stevenson delivered the final, crushing blow. "I am prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over," he said, "and I am also prepared to present the evidence in this room." At that moment, UN aides brought in large photographic easels and mounted the U-2 surveillance photos for all the delegates to see. They showed, in undeniable detail, the missile sites, the erectors, the tents, and the Soviet equipment. The lie had been exposed for the entire world to see. Stevenson walked the council through the photos, pointing out the specific evidence. Zorin was left speechless and humiliated. It was a masterful performance, a resounding diplomatic victory for the United States. It solidified international support, particularly from the Organization of American States, which voted unanimously to endorse the quarantine. But as the delegates filed out of the UN chamber, the men in XCOM knew that this victory, as sweet as it was, did not change the military reality. The photos Stevenson displayed were already a few days old. Newer photos, taken that very morning, showed that the Soviets were working around the clock. The missile sites were rapidly approaching operational status. The quarantine had stopped more missiles from arriving, but the ones already there would soon be able to fire. The clock was still ticking, and the most dangerous days were yet to come. Part 3. Black Saturday. As the world held its breath, the first glimmer of a possible breakthrough came on Friday, October 26th. A new message began to arrive from Moscow via the teletype. It was not a formal diplomatic cable. It was long, rambling, and deeply emotional. It was clearly written by Nikita Khrushchev himself, pouring out his fears and frustrations. He wrote about the horrors of war, of the knot of war that both he and Kennedy had tied, and the responsibility they shared to untie it. He compared the situation to a rope with a knot in the middle. The more each side pulled, the tighter the knot would get, until it could no longer be untied. "A moment may come," he wrote, "when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it, and then it will be necessary to cut that knot. And what that would mean is not for me to explain to you." Buried within this long, almost stream of consciousness message was the core of a deal. Khrushchev was offering a way out. He proposed that if President Kennedy would guarantee that the United States would not invade Cuba, he, in turn, would remove the missiles under United Nations supervision. It was the first real offer, the first sign that a peaceful resolution might be possible. The members of XCOM were cautiously optimistic. This was something they could work with. Their optimism was bolstered later that same afternoon by a strange and secret development. John Scarley, a respected television correspondent for ABC News, received an urgent message to meet a contact at the Occidental Grill, a popular Washington restaurant. His contact was Alexander Fomin, a known counselor at the Soviet embassy who Scarley knew was also the KGB's station chief in Washington. Fomin was visibly agitated. He told Scarley that a great tragedy was about to happen and asked if Scarley's high-level contacts at the State Department would be interested in a proposal to resolve the crisis. Fomin then laid out a deal. The Soviet Union would dismantle its missile bases in Cuba under UN supervision, in exchange for a public pledge from the United States not to invade the island. It was the exact same offer that was in Khrushchev's emotional letter. Fomin urged Scarley to find out immediately if the United States would be interested. Scarley rushed to the State Department, where he was immediately brought in to see Dean Rusk. The back channel was now open. It appeared to confirm that the offer from Khrushchev was real and serious. For the first time in 10 days, it seemed like a peaceful end was in sight. The sense of relief in the White House on Friday night was real. But the relief was short-lived. It was shattered the next morning. Saturday, October 27th, would go down in history as Black Saturday, the single most dangerous day of the Cold War, and perhaps in all of human history. The day began with a new message from Moscow. But this was not like the emotional, personal letter from the day before. This message was broadcast publicly over Radio Moscow for the entire world to hear. It was formal, cold, and much more demanding. It added a new public condition to the deal. Khrushchev would remove the missiles from Cuba only if the United States removed its analogous missiles from Turkey. This new demand threw ExCom into turmoil. The Jupiter missiles in Turkey were a major sticking point. On paper, it was a reasonable tit-for-tat trade. The American missiles in Turkey were just as close to the Soviet Union as the Soviet missiles in Cuba were to the United States. In fact, President Kennedy had long considered the Jupiter missiles to be obsolete and vulnerable. He had actually ordered their removal months earlier, but the order had gotten tied up in bureaucratic delays. The problem was one of perception and politics. If Kennedy agreed to this publicly, it would look like he was capitulating to Soviet blackmail. It would be seen as a trade, not a victory. America's NATO allies, especially Turkey, would feel betrayed, believing their security was being bargained away. The NATO alliance, the cornerstone of Western defense, could fracture. The hawks in ExCom were furious. They saw the new demand as proof that Khrushchev was stalling and could not be trusted. The path of diplomacy suddenly seemed to be a dead end. As the advisors debated this new, complicated situation, the crisis escalated dramatically. At around noon, word reached the White House that a U.S. Air Force U-2 spy plane had been shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was killed. This was the moment everyone had dreaded. American military personnel had been killed by a Soviet weapon on the direct orders of a Soviet commander. The agreed-upon rules of engagement were clear. If a U-2 was fired upon, the U.S. was to respond by launching a retaliatory strike and destroying the responsible SAM missile site. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were now unanimous. They formally recommended to the President that an attack be launched against the missile site the next morning. The pressure on Kennedy was almost unbearable. General LeMay and the other chiefs argued that failing to respond would be a catastrophic show of weakness. To them, the time for talk was over. An act of war had occurred, and it demanded a military response. President Kennedy, however, hesitated. He understood that once the first bomb dropped, the situation could spiral out of control within minutes. He made the lonely, momentous decision to overrule his military advisors. He forbade the retaliatory strike, at least for now. He would wait. But the clock was now ticking faster than ever. The crisis continued to escalate. In a completely separate incident that same day, another American U-2 on a routine air sampling mission near the North Pole accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia. The Soviets scrambled MiG fighter jets to intercept it. In response, the U.S. Air Force scrambled nuclear-armed F-102 fighters from Alaska to protect the U-2 and escort it home. For a terrifying period, nuclear-armed planes from both superpowers were in the air, heading towards each other. A dogfight, a miscalculation, a single shot fired in the frigid Arctic air could have been misinterpreted as the opening salvo of a nuclear attack, potentially triggering a full-scale response from the Strategic Air Command. Fortunately, the U-2 pilot managed to get his bearings and fly out of Soviet territory before the fighters made contact. When President Kennedy heard of the incident, he reportedly shook his head and said, "There is always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the word." It was a stark reminder of how easily the carefully laid plans of leaders could be undone by accident and human error. But the most terrifying incident of Black Saturday was one that the leaders in Washington and Moscow knew nothing about until decades later. Deep in the Atlantic Ocean, the U.S. Navy was enforcing the quarantine. The destroyer USS Beale made sonar contact with a Soviet submarine, designated B-59. To signal the submarine to surface for identification, the Beale began dropping small, practiced depth charges. These were tiny explosives, about the size of a hand grenade, designed to make a loud noise and signal the crew, not to damage the hull. But down below, in the cramped, sweltering, and claustrophobic confines of the B-59, the crew had a very different perception of events. They had been submerged for days, cut off from all communication with Moscow. They had no idea if war had already broken out. All they knew was that explosions were going off around their hull. The captain of the submarine, Valentin Savitsky, believed he was under attack. He was convinced that World War III had started. And the B-59 was not just any submarine. It was armed with a secret weapon, a single torpedo with a 15-kiloton nuclear warhead, with roughly the same destructive power as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The standing orders for using this weapon were vague, but Savitsky believed he had the authority to launch it if he was attacked. He ordered the nuclear torpedo to be prepared. He said, We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. However, the protocol for launching the nuclear torpedo required the unanimous consent of the 3 senior officers on board. The captain, Savitsky, wanted to launch. The political officer on board also gave his consent. The launch sequence was about to begin. But the 3rd officer, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, refused. Arkhipov was the commodore of the entire submarine flotilla. He held a rank equal to the captain's. Arkhipov argued against the launch. He reasoned that the signals from the American destroyer were not necessarily an attack. He managed to calm the captain down, persuading him that launching the torpedo would be a catastrophic mistake. After a heated argument, Arkhipov convinced the captain to surface the submarine and await orders from Moscow. A single man's calm judgment in an unimaginably tense situation prevented a nuclear launch that would have instantly destroyed the USS Beale and the surrounding carrier group. The United States would have undoubtedly retaliated with a massive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. Vasily Arkhipov, a man whose name was unknown to the world for 40 years, had single-handedly saved the world from a nuclear holocaust. As Saturday, October 27th, drew to a close, the men of XCOM were exhausted and despondent. They were facing an impossible situation. A US pilot was dead, and the military was demanding retaliation. They had 2 conflicting sets of demands from Khrushchev, and time was running out. The missile sites in Cuba were just hours away from becoming fully operational. Robert Kennedy would later write that evening, "I think these were the hardest decisions that any group of men had to make. The odds that we would all be alive by the next week were 50-50 at best." The world had never been closer to the abyss. Part 4. The Secret Deal. As the sun set on Black Saturday, the mood inside the White House was the darkest it had been in the entire crisis. The United States and the Soviet Union seemed locked on a collision course. A US pilot was dead. The American military was demanding an immediate retaliatory attack, and the messages from Moscow were contradictory and confusing. One letter offered a simple deal, while a second, public message demanded a politically impossible trade. The world was just hours away from a full-scale military conflict that would almost certainly escalate into a global nuclear war. Faced with this tangled mess, a moment of strategic genius emerged from the exhaustion and despair. The idea, primarily championed by Robert Kennedy and the President's special counsel, Ted Sorensen, was both incredibly simple and audacious. They called it the Trollope ploy, a reference to a literary device used in the novels of Anthony Trollope, where a female character treats an unwelcome marriage proposal as if it had never been offered. The strategy was to do just that, completely ignore Khrushchev's second, more demanding letter, the one demanding the removal of missiles from Turkey, and respond only to the first, more emotional and conciliatory letter. They would act as if the second message simply did not exist. The team worked late into Saturday night, drafting a formal response to Khrushchev. The letter was carefully worded. It deliberately misinterpreted parts of Khrushchev's first message, framing the deal in the most favorable light for the United States. It accepted the core bargain. The Soviets would remove the missiles under United Nations observation, and in return, the United States would issue a formal guarantee that it would not invade Cuba. The letter was firm. It set a very short deadline, and it placed the burden of the next move squarely back on the Kremlin. It was a final offer, a last chance for a peaceful resolution before the military option became the only one left. But President Kennedy knew that this formal letter alone might not be enough. The issue of the American Jupiter missiles in Turkey was the real obstacle. While he could not publicly agree to trade them under duress, he understood that Khrushchev needed a way to save face. He needed something more than just a non-invasion pledge. To solve this, Kennedy turned to the one man he trusted above all others, his brother, Robert. He dispatched the Attorney General on a secret, urgent mission to meet with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. This clandestine meeting, held at the Department of Justice on Saturday evening, would be the most critical negotiation of the entire crisis. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Robert Kennedy began by formally presenting the American letter, making it clear that time was running out. He spoke of the immense pressure his brother was under from the military to launch an attack. He conveyed the gravity of the situation, explaining that if a positive response from Moscow was not received quickly, the United States would be forced to take military action. Then, he turned to the unspoken issue. He acknowledged that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey were a major complication, and then he made the secret offer, the critical sweetener that was not in the official letter. He told Dobrynin that the president had been wanting to remove those missiles for a long time. He explained that they were obsolete and that the administration had already been planning to replace them with submarine-based Polaris missiles, which were far more effective and less vulnerable. He gave the ambassador his personal assurance that if the Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba, the Jupiter missiles in Turkey would be removed soon after. He stressed that this had to be an absolute secret. There could be no public announcement, no quid pro quo. If the Soviets ever tried to portray it as a public trade, the deal was off. It was a verbal promise, an understanding between leaders that would allow Khrushchev to tell his colleagues in the Presidium that he had won a secret concession, while allowing Kennedy to publicly maintain that he had not backed down. With the message delivered, all the Americans could do was wait. The final decision now rested with one man, Nikita Khrushchev, halfway around the world in Moscow. The invasion of Cuba was tentatively scheduled to begin in 48 hours. The night of October 27th and the early morning of Sunday, October 28th, were agonizingly quiet. The fate of the world hung in the balance, waiting on a teletype machine. Then, at 9 a.m. Washington time, the news broke. Radio Moscow began broadcasting a new public message from Chairman Khrushchev. There was a nervous scramble in the White House to get the message translated. As the words came through, an almost unbelievable wave of relief washed over the room. Khrushchev had accepted the deal. He announced to the world that he had given a new order to dismantle the arms which you described as offensive, and to crate and return them to the Soviet Union. He acknowledged Kennedy's non-invasion pledge, framing the resolution as a victory for peace and common sense. The immediate crisis was over. President Kennedy immediately drafted a response, which he released to the public. He avoided any triumphant language. He did not gloat. Instead, he welcomed Khrushchev's message, calling it an important and constructive contribution to peace. He praised his counterpart's statesmanlike decision and acknowledged the courage it took to de-escalate the conflict. The 13 days of eyeball-to-eyeball tension had finally come to an end. Around the world, people wept with relief. The shadow of nuclear annihilation, which had grown so dark, had finally begun to recede. In the aftermath, the world slowly began to process what had just happened and to take steps to ensure it would never happen again. True to Robert Kennedy's secret promise, the American Jupiter missiles were quietly removed from Turkey a few months later. This part of the deal was so secret that it was kept hidden from the American public and even from most of the members of ExComm for many years. For decades, the public narrative was that Kennedy had stood firm, stared down the Soviets, and forced them into a unilateral retreat. The reality that the crisis was resolved through a secret compromise was a much more complex lesson in diplomacy. The leaders themselves were profoundly changed by the experience. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev were sobered by how close they had come to catastrophe. They recognized that a major contributing factor to the danger was poor communication. Messages had to be sent through public channels or complex back channels, taking hours to be delivered and translated. To fix this, the Moscow-Washington hotline was established in August of 1963. This direct, secure teletype link, popularly known as the Red Telephone, would allow the leaders of the two superpowers to communicate instantly and clearly in any future crisis. The brush with Armageddon also provided a powerful impetus for the first meaningful steps in arms control. Having looked into the abyss, both leaders were now more determined than ever to pull back. Their efforts culminated in the signing of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, also in 1963. This landmark agreement banned all nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. It did not end the arms race, but it was the first time the two superpowers had formally agreed to put limits on it. It was a direct and positive legacy born from the terror of those 13 days. The crisis had different political outcomes for the leaders involved. For John F. Kennedy, his handling of the situation was hailed as a masterpiece of crisis management. He was seen as strong, patient, and wise, solidifying his stature on the world stage. For Nikita Khrushchev, the outcome was far more damaging at home. Although he had successfully prevented an invasion of Cuba and even extracted a secret concession on the Turkey missiles, the public perception was that he had been forced to back down by the Americans. This humiliation was used against him by his rivals in the Kremlin, and it was a significant factor in his overthrow from power 2 years later. For Fidel Castro, the resolution brought a sense of betrayal. He was furious that Khrushchev had made a deal without consulting him. But, ultimately, the American pledge not to invade secured the future of his revolution. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains the single most dangerous moment in recorded history. It was a political thriller played out on a global stage, with the survival of humanity as the stakes. It taught the world terrifying lessons about the logic of nuclear deterrence and the ease with which nations could stumble into an unwinnable war. But it also provided enduring lessons in the power of communication, the importance of seeing a crisis from an adversary's point of view, and the courage required for leaders to choose compromise over confrontation. It was a story of threats and secret deals, of military pressure and back-channel diplomacy that pulled the world back from the brink of annihilation. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.